Hey everybody, we are Martin, Robert, and Francis, and this is Snakes and Otters, a pointless discussion of eternal questions. Get ready, we're about to live in your head rent-free. Hey everybody, welcome back to Snakes and Otters. This is episode 67. I am Martin.
I'm Robert.
And I'm Francis.
And listeners, we are practically giddy today. We are together. The Fellowship of Snakes and Otters. We are not recording remotely this time. We're very excited to be here at Studio M doing a live in-person recording.
Hey, yeah.
It's 5 months.
That's right.
Yes,
5 months.
It's been a long time, as Mick Fleetwood would say.
Yes. And this is also a special episode in that we have a special guest today. My son Bjern is sitting in with us because he is all about this particular topic. And that topic is Ragnar Lothbrok, man or myth?
Or both.
So today we're going to be discussing the historical figure of Ragnar Lothbrok, the Viking. And a little setup here. When we originally planned this episode, listeners, the reason we invited Bjern to be our special guest is he was due to be back from a study abroad trip this summer. And he was going to be spending the summer studying in Scandinavia. So his dream come true. So that, of course, that did not happen, as all of that kind of thing was canceled in the wake of the pandemic. But we are moving forward. We're not letting that deter us. We are moving on. So say hello, Bjern.
Hello. Welcome to Bjern. That's correct. Yes, who's quite the expert on this subject.
Yes.
Just because he couldn't go doesn't mean he didn't do the independent study, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are readings that we had to do, about Viking legends, myths, various stories. So
Makes us all a little giddy, doesn't it?
Yeah, this is pretty amazing. So let's start off, Bjern. How about just a little background on who Ragnar Lothbrok was?
Well, he was a legendary king in Denmark and around the late 700s, early 800s. He is a notable figure in a few different saga stories, like he's in the Icelandic sagas. He's in the Gesta Danorum, which is a Danish source. He's also in a lot of Saxon writings, Irish writings, and then Frankish writings. He was the father to a lot of very famous Viking figures that raided all across Europe. Bjern Ironside actually made it to Italy and further east in the Mediterranean, and Ivar conquered England and Ireland along with his other brothers during the invasion of the Great Heathen Army.
I gotta say, of all of the sons that he had, Sigurd Snake in the Eye has got to be my favorite name.
Yes.
I just had to put that out there.
Yeah. Well, so, the basis of that name is very interesting, which I'll get into once I start talking more about the myth behind Ragnar and the story that precedes him.
Right. So he is thought to be a genuine historical figure.
Yes.
And the sons are attested to be genuine historical figures.
The sons for sure are.
The sons for sure are real people, and then Ragnar's father, Sigurd Ring, is a real person. Ragnar Lothbrok, it's a bit different of a story. There's some version of him which is probably true, and then there's some version of him that is just myth. It's just
there's been much controversy depending on who you talk to. Some will say, "Oh, absolutely, he was," and others say, "You're all wet. He never was."
Yeah.
Well, if we know that the father is real, and those that are his sons, are we sure that they are actually all brothers, so that there is a common father?
There is a common father. Some of them are half brothers,
right?
And
well,
but not uncommon.
Well, yeah, I was going to say
uncommon.
one of the consistent things about Ragnar that we find out is he was the definite horn dog, as we will learn.
So, the common father, then there has to have been an historical person. Because we know his father, we know his sons. So.
That's right.
Yeah,
somebody did. Question is it anything like the stories we have?
Yeah,
exactly.
There are many stories that attribute that there is a Ragnar-like character in these various places.
Okay.
So, I guess the basis behind Ragnar is there's the story that comes before him. It's called the Volsung Saga, which, if you've ever heard of like Wagner and his operas, that's the Siegfried story.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same thing, just in German. It follows Sigurd Fafnir's Bane, and Sigurd Fafnir's Bane. He kills the dragon Fafnir, which is really just the giant snake, and this plays into the name Sigurd Snake in the Eye. So Sigurd Fafnir's Bane marries a Valkyrie named Brynhilda, and they have a child together.
After they sing a lot, right?
Yeah.
Lots of singing.
I mean, the only thing I know about Wagner is what's
Kill the wabbit, kill the wabbit, kill the wabbit.
That's right.
Yes. But they had a child together named Auslug. And she, when she is born, she basically gets sort of shipped off to a Norwegian peasant family, and she goes by the name Kraka, which means crow. So, after that comes the story of Ragnar. So, his actual name is Ragnar Sigurdsson, because of the way that they did naming. It's patronymic.
Right.
You're named after your father. And his father is Sigurd Ring, the legendary king.
I love the $10 word, patronymic.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
It's not common in English speaking.
No, but it is still used in Russian names. All Russian family names use a patronymic, either masculine or feminine.
Parvana.
Exactly, as both their surnames and the middle name. That's not really a middle name; it's a patronymic name. It's very alien to us in the West, but in the East, it's very common.
They also still do it in Iceland and the Faroe Islands.
That's right. It's all that. It's all an Eastern concept that's came up. I kind of like it myself. I think it's something that we've lost in many ways that they've retained. But
it's an interesting concept. It allows them to look back on their history and say,
absolutely,
it sure make genealogy a lot easier.
Yeah, wouldn't it though? That's right. That's exactly right. Well, family is one of those important concepts, and anything that supports that, hey, we're in for that.
Yeah. So to get more into Ragnar, there are a few different sagas, namely the Icelandic sagas, that are called the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, Ragnarssona Fóttur, Heimskringla, Hervarar Saga, Sogabrot, and all these basically tell Ragnar's story at various points in time. He early on in his story, it's more of the marriages in the Icelandic sagas. So he is described as the biggest and fairest of the men in Scandinavia. He took after his mother a lot. His first claim to fame in the stories is he first killed a giant snake that guarded the house of Thora Borgarhjort, which became his first wife. And when he fought the snake, he wore a special type of pants that were shaggy, and so that's where the name Lothbrok comes in. It means shaggy pants. Yeah,
not the most flattering name you
couldn't get a hold
with.
of him. All he got a hold of was pants.
Yeah, basically.
Whatever it takes, I guess.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well,
all right, Mr. Shaggy Pants. All right.
So with Thora, he had two sons, Erik and Agnar. But unfortunately, Thora died later on, and Ragnar remarried Kraka before knowing that Kraka was actually Auslug. So together they had many more sons. They had Ivar the Boneless, Bjern Ironside, and based off of the Danish pronunciation at the time, most likely Huitserk, and Ragnvald, and then Sigurd Snake in the Eye. So,
and listeners, I'll interrupt Björn here. He's serious about this business. He's even researching the pronunciations from the 700s, and he has his drinking horn, his Viking drinking horn, right here on the table with him.
Yes.
So now he does not have bourbon in his.
No, he is not yet of age.
He's not yet of age. But we all have, finally, as I promised, a glass of Bullet bourbon.
Indeed.
That I finally was saving for this occasion.
Finally cracked it open.
And I'm very pleased. Bullet's pretty solid.
Robert and I have actual drinking glasses from Bullet.
Yes.
Here, which is kind of cool. That was grateful for you for saving that for us.
Yes, they've not been used at all.
Oh yeah, so we get to inaugurate that.
This is a very fine bourbon. This is got a nice burn that stays in the mouth, the top of the throat, as opposed to an Angel's Envy, which tends to burn down into the stomach, which is interesting because I don't know how you get it to stay up there, but all right.
Just the way it works. And the flavor,
it's nice flavor, yes.
Yeah, the flavor's staying on the tongue a little longer.
It is. It's definitely not sweet. There's no sweetness to it at all.
No, I don't get
it's
the
got that
maple syrup.
dryness to it. But the actual product, it styles itself as frontier whiskey, even though it is bourbon. And it says it's bourbon if you read a little further. But it's got a bite to it that some of our other stuff, sometimes the stuff, the Devil's Cut you had has a similar bite.
I think this is much milder than that.
Yeah.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
Smoother, I would say.
Yeah, smoother, yeah.
Smoother, it's woodsy, a little woodsy like the
That's
Old
a good
Tub.
word. That's a very good word.
That
yeah.
oaky wood.
Because Old Tub is unfiltered.
Yeah, and it's staying
This
on,
doesn't
like I
have
said,
that
It stays on the
viscousness.
tongue
This
a little longer.
This is cleaner.
Yeah.
But it's potent. It's fecund. We like those great words. We can come up with all sorts of wonderful words for this sort of stuff. But it's great.
But Bjern, you're talking about the sons. So the sons are part of how we know at least some person named Ragnar existed, because eventually, as you mentioned, the sons will come to lead what's known as the Great Heathen Army.
Yes.
That really did invade England in the 800s. And all of that basically starts because of the raid in 793 of Lindisfarne Abbey.
But to tie this into pop culture, for goodness sakes, Vikings nails this pretty darn accurately. Considering you have multiple sources
somewhat.
here.
Well,
they've synthesized it because you've got multiple sources from different languages and different approaches, so it's not meant to be a regurgitation of that, but they've kind of created this consistency among them, and of course it starts at Lindisfarne, which was it was an apocalyptic moment for the Saxons.
It was a serious turning point in Saxon history.
In Saxon history, that's right. And in fact, and I'll give a slight plug for the great courses, which I love to listen to. They do one of the series that I've subscribed to with them is Great Turning Points in History, and Lindisfarne is one of them.
Yeah.
Because everything changed with that. Because no longer were there two separate cultures and countries. They all came together, as you might suspect, violently, and changed the course of things from there.
Yeah. But go ahead and talk.
But it's all been on TV.
Yeah.
So if you want to visualize this, both Vikings TV series and The Last Kingdom, which we'll get into that a little bit later, does a damn good job of laying this out. Something that was not in our culture cinematically before that, other than the Kirk Douglas and Tony Curtis movie, The Vikings. Great movie, by the way. Fantastic movie. But that's about it. You didn't do much with this before.
Yeah. Well, our conception of history really only goes back to Hastings.
That's right. That's right. We're very we're a post-Norman English people. That is the watershed moment. Before that, it's kind of terra incognita, even though, ironically, Alfred the Great is the only English king styled with that title.
And there's a reason for that.
And there's a reason for that, which we'll get into.
Yeah. Yep. Go ahead, Bjern.
So, essentially, at this point in Ragnar's life, his sons have grown up, and they've become very famous. They've become essentially more famous than he has. And so, not wanting to be outdone, he makes an oath that he's going to conquer England with just 2 ships, which horribly backfires. He gets
Imagine that.
Yes.
he gets captured by King Aella of Northumbria and then summarily executed in a pit of snakes.
As executions go, which is usually where a lot of folks tend to focus because they're brilliantly dramatic moment. This one's unique Can't understand
Snakes.
anybody.
Why did it have to be
Snakes.
snakes?
I was hoping somebody would go there. That's exactly right.
Post Lindisfarne. I mean, Lindisfarne.
Yeah,
that was years later. Yeah.
Lindisfarne is basically where they discover that there's this other land to their west,
which is interesting because at this point, Proto-Germanic has split off into different groups, cultural groups, linguistic groups. And so Old English and Old Norse aren't that different. Like, it's only been, a few decades. But they've already lost all of these records or history of there's this other group of people that is from, the continental Europe. They just don't realize that this is, this
is only 3 centuries, 3 or 4 centuries after the fall of Rome. So all those connections that were so tight before are no longer. And they've just kind of done their own thing. And Northern Europe is definitely not Christian, still pagan. Yes. Whereas the Saxon kingdoms of what we would call England today are highly Christian. Which
recently becoming Christian.
Very much so. That's correct. Augustine of Canterbury.
And that's a very important point. England is not a single polity
that's correct.
At this point.
There's
Northumbria, Wessex,
5 essential
Sussex,
kingdoms. Mercia is the biggest. Yeah,
and East Anglia.
East Anglia, that's right. All those together have, in many respects, tribalized. And even though they're ethnically the same, even though they're religiously the same, which actually plays dividends when the pagans come. Oh, my dear brother and friend, you Christian, let's go together and knock out the pagans. It doesn't.
It's like the French and Robin Williams.
That's right.
Oh, you Americans, get out of here! We hate you. Oh, the Germans are here. Oh, we love you, Americans. Come on, come in.
It's exactly right.
But that's important in that these are all these separate polities that have to get along. It makes them very vulnerable to an invasion by a determined adversary like the Vikings.
And it's only through
the Danes or the Northmen.
That is correct.
Whatever you would call it.
And it's only through, and I'm not trying to get ahead of you here, Bjorn, but only through the greatness of, in many respects, one man, Alfred.
It's his vision.
It's his vision. That's correct. And that's
England.
That's correct. His grandfather had talked about it a little bit, Egbert, which we see very brilliantly, portrayed by Linus Roche in the Vikings series. Yes. He had the initial vision, but he couldn't really make it happen. Alfred, under duress, of course, essentially brings into birth modern England, and we have Ragnar to thank for that in many ways.
Yeah.
But we don't mean to steal your thunder, but that's what we do here sometimes at Snakes and
We're
Otters.
free flowing there.
We're free flowing, but please continue with your discussion here.
So after Ragnar dies at the hands of Aela, word comes back to the sons. And the show, this comes in the form of Odin visiting all the sons, the sons hearing Ragnar's last words, like how the little piggies will grunt when they hear how the old boar suffered. That's more of the mythology behind his story and how the sons actually come together. But nevertheless, in history, they come together, they form the Great Heathen Army, and they invade and basically make all of the English kings their bitch. So,
very well put. That's correct. Yes. Northumbria falls, East Anglia falls, Mercia even falls, which supposedly couldn't happen, with only one holding out.
Yes.
And that would be the great kingdom in the south of Wessex.
So, in the story, the saga, the sons capture Aela, and they execute him by a very brutal method called Blood Eagle.
Oh, yes.
So what is Blood Eagle?
So Blood Eagle is essentially a person is stood up on a podium with their arms outstretched, and their back is cut into with a knife, and then the skin's pulled back. So then the executor then takes an axe and chops away at each of the ribs to where they pop out. And then the lungs are pulled out and draped over the shoulder. And all of that is done while the person is alive. Yeah, so you're basically, in a way, you're also suffocating from the blood going into your lungs and pooling. And there's an extra bit of myth to it.
Keep in mind, Bjorn, we've just eaten.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Well, the Viking series shows this. There's an episode entitled "The Blood Eagle." It's not Aela that does this. It's Ragnar does it while he's still alive in the show. That pretty much lays this out on screen. I mean, as much as you can get away.
Yeah, it's all gruesome for sure.
It's pretty darn clear what's going on here.
Yeah, and then there's a bit of extra mythology to it, is that a person being executed by Blood Eagle was not allowed to scream or make any noise, and if you could do that...
What are they going to do?
Yeah,
what are they going to do?
But here's the thing. If they did that, they were granted access to Valhalla, basically. It was another way to try and get into Valhalla, like a last-ditch effort. You just couldn't scream.
Right.
But
Ayla could care less because he's
Yeah,
I thought you meant like there was some
idea.
extra penalties. Like, what else are they going to do to him?
Oh, well, yeah.
yeah.
So it was a challenge, more so than extra penalty.
Yeah. So, but of course, Ayla didn't.
He could care less. That's right,
Yeah. So the invasion of the Great Heathen Army then starts a essentially 200-year period where the Danes occupy at least some portions of the British Isles.
Not just the Danes, but the Norwegians too.
Yes.
But the Norwegians tended to go more north into Scotland.
But the Danes are in
Northumbria. Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia.
And it becomes called the Danelaw.
Yeah, the government that they set up.
It almost becomes Daneland, which ultimately is what England would have become. It would never have been England. It would have been Daneland had Wessex essentially been conquered, and from that point forward, it would all been Danicized, to use the term.
Yes.
But Saxon and English culture not only thrives, but it rises again.
Yeah. And as we know, they of course intermingle.
Exactly, and it does form a new culture, which that's one of the things that we don't get really.
The Danes don't really leave.
No, that's correct. They become English.
Sort of English.
That's right. The Saxon and the Danes create this new English race, which is proto-English race, because it's only with Hastings and the infusion of the Norman French that the true English people that we know today, not British, English, that's what they're an amalgamation of all those three
and
peoples.
That would eventually be 1066. And,
that's right.
Which
is 200 years after all this.
Like we say, the throne of England passes back and forth between Saxons and Danes a couple of times.
Canute was one of the most famous and best of the pre-conquest monarchs. He's not as famous as Alfred, but he's pretty darn close, and he was Danish completely. They make a deal and let him be the king of all this proto-England at the time, which was being known as England. So it's a fascinating subject of how everything is homogenized together.
So there wasn't a long road to go for the homogenization, though. As Bjern pointed out,
that's how we can.
There's a very common route to both the Saxons and the Danes, and those that are coming in. And when you think about it, I mean, the Danish lands basically sit on top of Germany.
Yeah.
So there's back and forth between them already,
which is obvious in modern day Germany with Holstein and Schleswig. It's very Danish and German mixed together.
Exactly. It's kind of like along the French border, where you have a lot of German and French intermingling in terms and what have you.
Right. You can really see that during Christmas time too.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
The difference between how Germanic people celebrate Christmas and how French people celebrate Christmas, and it's blending there.
That's right, and it's the beauty of the thing for us for today. That's a reason that most Europeans speak more than one language.
Yeah,
I mean, there's a commonality is that they're very they're multilingual in many aspects, which we Americans totally don't get.
Well, I mean, but as I pointed this out many times, people don't. Those that are non-American, they sometimes forget this. It's easy when you are in Europe or somewhere else to pick a second language, because it's either going to be English, because that's what Americans speak, or it's going to be whatever country you deal with the most, which often is America, but that's easy for us. What's our default second language? Sure. It's a lot harder for us to pick, because wherever we go, there's almost always somebody who speaks our first language.
Yeah, that's right. It just doesn't happen much. I mean, Spanish in many respects, from if you're down south,
it is
you're getting
coming
some
by
of that.
default the second language. Yes,
right. A little bit of French, perhaps, if you're way up in the north, but that's never.
Or maybe in Louisiana.
That's true. There's still a cultural connection down there that they have embraced. That's not been allowed.
That's mainly a New Orleans thing.
That's
but
right.
Yes, it's still.
There's also German and Pennsylvania.
That's correct. I mean, there's multiple places like that where you still have in Dutch as well.
Well, it's not. It's a misnomer. It's not actually Dutch. It's a version of German that is called Pennsylvania Dutch.
Well, Dutch is Deutsch.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly.
It's the other thing.
Exactly.
Yeah,
it is
yeah.
German. It's just that's how it's.
Yes,
Germany
Germany
is quite a
Deutsch.
lesson in that too. In that we tend to think of that as a relatively new phenomenon. This idea of blending cultures and that America is a melting pot.
Every place is a melting pot.
History is a melting pot.
That's correct.
Rome was a melting pot.
Very much so.
The Saxon kingdoms were a melting pot.
The thing about the Saxon kingdoms that makes it so fun is because it happened in a relatively short period of time in one crucible, one island kingdom. So we get to watch it happen because of the great documentation of history that
it's like what Darwin in the Galapagos. I mean, it's a laboratory.
It's a laboratory.
You
can get your arms around it because, like in America, it's harder to see because it's very regionalized. But this was a countrywide phenomenon that took place over a relatively short period of time, 300 years maybe.
Well, geography aside with the size of our country, one of the reasons I think what makes us thought of as a melting pot more than other places is that while there was an indigenous people here, the melting pot took place over top of them, replaced them as opposed to mingling with them. I mean, there was obviously some mingling with the indigenous peoples, but unlike in England or anywhere else people moved into, there was very little mixing, and so the melting pot that happened here was totally self-contained.
Right.
And that's what I think makes this kind of melting pot more unique than in others. And it's also, the entire country was founded that way as opposed to, you move into an area that's already populated and you melt together. So
200 years of history, they finally, pretty much the Saxons take the kingdom back, only to have one Norse,
the Normans,
replaced by a whole different Norse background in the Normans.
Irony of ironies, is that the Norman French themselves were not really French. They were Vikings. They were Norse because the TV show lays this out pretty well. Although they get a little funky with their history. Ragnar and Rollo, and they're really no relation.
They never existed at the same time.
No, exactly. But it's a way of tying these two things together. But the ancestor Rollo from the TV series is the ancestor of the Norman French. When they basically decided we want all the nice things you French people have down here. The French, as they are so often prone to do, says, "Let us buy you off. We'll give you this little area called Normandy. It's yours. Be us." And that's ultimately what happens.
And that's the origin of
the Normans.
Normandy it's the land of the Northmen.
That's exactly
Normandy.
Right. Rollo and his crew came down there, and his families and all of them, and they essentially built in 300 years a French Norman. It was unique. It was far more powerful than the pure French, if there is such a thing. The Franks were at that time. They had a strain of, shall we say, violence or conquest in them that ultimately made William the Bastard decide to cross the channel and lay claim to England.
Yep. So they traded one Northman for another.
That's right. And therefore,
but even that ties a bit to Ragnar because there's a raid into all the way to Paris.
Right. Yes. So supposedly a Ragnar-like figure raided into Paris.
So this is where the myth starts to come in.
Yeah, where a different source says maybe he went to Paris.
Somebody did, because the French are pretty clear about what happened.
Yes.
It's very well dramatized in the TV series.
Yes.
They kind of tie everything together and make some presumptions.
Yes.
But it's still pretty
even if
awesome.
it wasn't Ragnar, it's basically his
people.
Myth going ahead of him, and that the French or the Franks at that time are terrified.
Rightfully so.
The Northmen have that reputation.
That's right, and that's why they end up.
That's part of Ragnar's myth.
That's right, and that's why they end up buying them off in the end.
And that itself is a fascinating thing when you think about it, because let's put this in context of the rest of European history. Pardon. This is approximately 845. Is that right?
I believe so. I think
because it's near the end of his life.
This is 50 years after Charlemagne.
Exactly where I'm going.
Oh,
this
I didn't mean to steal your thunder.
This is barely 2 generations at best.
Yeah.
After Charlemagne, Charles the Great is what Charlemagne means, and that is when the Holy Roman Empire is established. That is basically what we know today as France and Germany, and a good deal of the lands south of what we consider Germany now: Czechoslovakia, Austria-Hungary,
Northern Italy,
Switzerland, all of that.
Yeah. So all of this was the new entity called the Holy Roman Empire. This was a big deal because this was the turning point from what you might, and you and I we've talked many times about whether or not the Middle Ages is the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, or because I contend that there's very little darkness, certainly beyond the Holy Roman Empire.
Once
there's
Charlemagne,
no darkness.
That's right. Once Charlemagne comes, he is the light.
Exactly.
And after you could make the case that prior to him it was dark, but after that, definitely not.
Right. Everything was well. By the time he gets to the point where he's reorganizing Europe into the new Holy Roman Empire, it had settled into its rut. But yes, it was definitely all on the way up from there. Mm-hmm. No Charlemagne, there is no Renaissance.
That's right.
So this being only 45 years past the declaration of the Holy Roman Empire, it to me is a fascinating thing, because who would have thought that these barbarians, for lack of a better term, would have the ability to drive all the way to France, into Paris, and sack it?
Well,
just 45 years.
That's what you get for putting a city on a river.
That's the thing, though. All cities are on rivers.
That's exactly.
But they were on an island in the middle of the river that went all the way through the heartland of France, which, of course, the Vikings took advantage of.
Well, Shakespeare called it the world's greatest garden. I mean, France was. I mean, there's lots to love about France. It's one of the most beautiful.
Yeah, except for the French people, it'd be wonderful. Sorry, there's a joke.
We love our French people. We love our French listeners. I'm sorry we're speaking English. I know that's very gauche of us, but nevertheless, but France was civilization, as Jean-Luc Picard would say.
Yeah,
for this to be threatened by these northern barbarians, I'll give the French credit here. They knew they could not resist them militarily. They tried, and they saw it very quickly.
Count Odo did have some success.
He did. That's correct. I mean, they were not. They didn't just roll over.
Yeah. And to tie this all, of course, to Charlemagne, the tradition in these Frankish kingdoms was not to keep the polity together,
right,
and let someone inherit it. The tradition was to split it up amongst the sons,
right,
and that's why it all came apart, because Charlemagne split it between sons, and
which is what happened to him. Ironically, it's what he inherited himself, and he ended up taking his brother Carloman's stuff and putting it all back together again,
only to then divide it back.
Which is that there's a fallacy for you. I mean, that just
you could make the argument that by doing so, he may have allowed the Holy Roman Empire to last 1,000 years. Because really it lasted until the 1800s.
Right. Napoleon's was finally declared dead.
It could be what crippled the Holy Roman Empire, because there was no clear line of succession, but there was no clear one ruler. Because it gets very quickly to the point where you have all of these prince electors that choose who the new emperor is going to be, and it was the mess that created the Germanies.
That's right, exactly. It shrank away. The French themselves decided, we don't want that. We will do our own thing. And by the time you get to Edward III of England, you got him essentially declaring himself at one point the Holy Roman Emperor. And it didn't last, but because they're all intermarried, they've all got claims.
Right.
To all these things, and it really gets very difficult at times.
But it's part of what fragments and makes it where they can't hold off the Northmen.
That's exactly right, because they are unified. The Northmen are not politically, but just by a cause. We want your stuff, and we're willing to come and get it from you, because you have nice things. Yes, we don't have those things.
They are the Negan of the 9th century.
Ooh, very good, sir. That's right. We want your stuff.
The Vikings are also more culturally unified than a lot of other places in Europe, because the difference between what would be an Old West Norse and Old East Norse, it's not that different.
Yeah.
You know, they have a very common language, you know, slight dialectal differences. They have a very common religion,
Right.
might not have been practiced the same, but they still had very
it was
common
wide
culture.
enough though. Paganism,
Yeah.
by its general nature, allows for variations.
Yeah.
But it was the same flavor,
Right.
essentially.
Sure, it's
maybe not the same flavor, but it was the same branch of paganism. It was all what we would call the Norse gods today.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
pantheons were essentially the same. In areas that mattered. You know, you could have your local ones if you wanted to, but you still had, you know, Odin, Thor, and all the rest.
Or in the, you know, West German areas, you know, Woden,
Yes.
Thurs.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Ultimately, same dance, different tune.
Yeah,
Different writers.
literally just a difference in how the language mutated and went off.
Not entirely unlike how the Greek gods became the Roman gods.
Yeah. Not quite as.
Although the Romans technically stole them.
I was
they
about
did,
to say
Roman
that.
stole
Yeah,
it.
that was the stole. This was more natural.
Yes,
more
but I mean,
organic.
it's well, all analogies are imperfect, but by their very nature.
Well, yours are usually pretty spot on, sir. I'll give you that.
So Bjern, you're doing a tremendous job. And listeners, I want you to know, Bjern's college major is not cultural anthropology. He's actually a physics major.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But as you can tell from this discussion, he loves this stuff.
He's a great example of, you know, well, we all four of us attended the same great institution.
That's correct.
And I think this show, I think, is the outgrowth of our attendance of that great institution that we call Bellarmine College / University for Bjorn. And that it was a, you know, for all of our critique of it of its adherence to its Catholicism, it is still a great example of a liberal arts education.
Oh, ding, ding, ding.
Because it wasn't just about training you to do a specific thing.
Right.
It was about teaching you to be a better person. You know, I didn't understand it then, but I see it now.
Yeah.
Yes.
We are well educated.
Yes,
And Bellarmine
Training us-
deserves a lot of that credit.
Training us to be seekers.
yes,
Well, that's right. Yes, exactly right. Where we're constantly looking for more information, more depth,
And what it means.
broader, and what search for meaning. You know,
It's perfect
Quick-
for Bjern.
Quick plug for my theology professor, my first semester. He said it was our vocation, sort of.
what
Yes.
that's exactly right. I mean,
Oh.
And who
Well
was
said.
that professor?
Dr. Choi.
Dr. Choi.
yeah,
Okay.
okay,
Yes.
exactly.
None of
Because
the people we had would still be there anymore.
Yeah,
No,
Dr. Choi he's a relatively new professor.
But Bellarmine has always had a robust theology department. Call
Yes.
out to some of our great professors, Father
Kilcourse.
George Kilcourse. I was going to say I've had in my profession right now. I have had contact with him at very good times. He's still out and about. Still one of the most brilliant minds that there are out there. Father Hendrickson, may he rest in peace. He taught us logic. Philosophy and theology are requirements at Bellarmine. And, hey, raise a glass to that, folks, because we can bemoan the state of American education today a lot, but there are still plenty of islands of great learning out there, and Bellarmine is one of them.
Yes.
So that was a great segue in where I wanted to take Bjern next, in that you're talking about this idea of being seekers and the broadening of our learning and our experience, in that we've talked about the historical Ragnar Lothbrok, but where he's really a big deal is again in that mythos, that mythology. Mm-hmm. And in our show prep, in our pre-show discussions, we began talking about how important mythology is. Every culture has a mythology, and it serves a purpose. And we talked a little bit about, myth is kind of a dirty word these days. That people feel it just means it's something completely false. It's,
you're right.
Apollo hauling the sun across the sky in a golden chariot. Well, but myth, in something being mythic, serves a purpose. It tells a story about your aspirations. A culture's mythology is aspirational.
Myth is, and we were talking about this in the show prep too, myth is a format. It really is not, and just because there are plenty of them that have no basis in reality, like Apollo, which is seeing something and making some sort of extrapolation based on that.
You see the sun moving across the sky during the day,
so you create
a chariot
something.
Must be pulling it.
That's right. That's a very different thing, even though it's all under this great umbrella of word called myth, than what you're talking about with Ragnar Lothbrok, or even all of our cultures have this great mythological piece, which is basically taking our stories, taking these truths, and you've sometimes said kernel of truth. I don't even like that, because sometimes it's a whole heaping bushel of truth. It's lots of truth that's formatted a certain way to make it stand the test of time. To make
in many
it,
ways,
make it to send it. It's the spaceship that carries the travelers through time.
I think the best way to understand myth is not the common way, which is seen in how everything is fact-checked by supposedly impartial people, because it's described as either fact or myth.
That's right. If it's not 100% fact, it's therefore dismissed.
Exactly.
And that is bad.
And unfortunately, people think they have a right to their own facts, but they don't. Even the fact-checkers sometimes have a right, so to speak, to their own facts. But where I want to go with this is that when you think about myth, especially when you're talking about the underpinning of a culture, it's not so much always explaining things we don't understand, or even it's a way to give meaning, and by meaning I mean those deep philosophical questions, because that's what the show's about.
Yes, that's what we're famous for, yes.
It is about giving meaning to what it means to be a people. Mm-hmm. To me, that's the best definition of myth. So when you look at what we would call now the Norse mythology, all of that, it wasn't necessarily so much about, well, our god, our sky father, whatever you want to choose to use to describe him, is Odin, and he has these sons, blah, blah, blah. All of that part is not so much important as what do you take from them that forms your culture, all right? So the Vikings being a very warrior centered race, they were
well, I mean, they weren't just warriors; they were traders. They were,
yes.
they were people that lived, their own lives. I mean,
I don't mean that they were only about conquering. When you think about what it means to be a warrior,
the conquering part was just a byproduct of the fact that they were very well off in terms of food.
Yes.
They didn't raid for food. They had so much food; they had an excess of food. They went raiding because why not?
Well, because they were expansionist. Yeah. Which is, but that's a cultural thing. Yeah. That is a cultural thing.
There was a possibility that if things would have happened just slightly differently, Sweden could have taken over more of Eastern Europe. The Norwegians could have gone more into the United States, and then the United States could have been just a Norwegian colony.
Sure.
They expanded.
That gets talked about a lot,
right,
which is usually an excuse to try and repudiate the English roots of our founding, but that's another thing.
Right.
But the Vikings even went as far... There's Viking runes in Constantinople.
Yes.
Russia...
Halfdan was here. It was the runes that were carved into Hagia Sophia.
Russia is a term for Rus.
The Rus Vikings, yeah.
And that means people that came from the north.
That's right.
The Vikings displaced the original inhabitants of...
They took over Kiev and...
ultimately, they were not... The Russians are not purely Slavic. We say that today because the word Slav today means something very different than it did at the time, but the Scandinavians, the Northerns, the Poles, and all those things basically came into Russia and remade it themselves. This is way back.
Yeah.
And by the time they're raiding into Constantinople, because there's something, and I guess we kind of danced around this, there's something about this Northern European character, genetically, culturally, I don't know, but it's persistent, because you'll notice that all this Scandinavian Northern European culture inserts itself into all these other, what we would call dominant cultures of Europe.
Determination.
That's correct.
Well, that's right back to where...
And I was getting ready to turn it back over to you, Robert. Go for it.
It's a great circle, finally get around back to it, but that's where I was going with, the myth is what we aspire to. It's what we give, what we look to for meaning about ourselves. So when I was talking about them being warrior-like, it wasn't necessarily about being, they're about the conquering, but when you think about what a warrior is, strong and brave and all of those things, that I think most people would recognize, we could attribute that to Vikings. We attribute that to a lot of people, but the point is, though, I think the Vikings, they didn't have gods that were distant. They had gods that they wanted to be like, as most people probably do. And I think to understand them, you have to understand their pantheon, because that, I think, definitely forms them.
I mean, if you look at like the roles of different gods, Tyr was their most important god for war, but then again, Odin also was associated with war, and so was Thor. Even I think sometimes Frigg was also associated with war. They had gods that filled multiple purposes,
right? And so when you look at all cultures, I think the mythology. So let's look at American culture. Many would say, "Well, we don't have a culture." Well, but we do, because we are so young. We see it more clearly as more historical than mythic, right? Because when you talk about something that is mythic, you also lose a little bit of that historicity, because it takes on a bit of, for lack of a better term, a little bit of magic, in the sense that it is
the chroniclers have to fill in the gaps.
Yeah,
and they use their imagination.
Right,
imagination.
So when you look at us, and you look at somebody like George Washington, the whole chopping down the cherry tree.
Yeah, that's a good American myth. Yeah,
throwing the coin across the Potomac. All of these things are probably not true. The coin almost certainly is not. But you look at these things, and they tell what it means, what we think it means to have been George Washington, about his character. And his character is something that we aspire to, even today.
And looking at the historical Washington, there's a lot of basis for that.
Right.
Yeah, so we've got the advantage of having good records historically and the myth together, so we can kind of notice where the two are the same and where they're not the same. But in most cases, in these ancient cultures, we don't have that luxury.
Yeah,
we try to extrapolate.
For example, I mean, with the Icelandic sagas about Ragnar, these were written a few hundred years after Ragnar was dead. Like,
absolutely.
Because while the Vikings and the Northmen, they had a writing system, they just didn't write down everything as detailed as, say, the Christian monks in
Ireland. They didn't see the need for that. That was, you're right, that's a very Frankish thing. That's a very Christian thing. And the Christians were very good at that. But the pagans, absolutely not. So much of that's lost to us.
The Icelanders were the first real group of people that were very literarily minded. They wrote down all these stories that were first passed down word of mouth, and then when they became Christianized and they started writing down more, they didn't have as much of an animosity towards it. They just wrote it down and like, well, this is what they used to do. This is how things were worshipped,
Right. So, maybe in the north of Europe, but I mean, the writing down about what happened, that goes back to Rome.
That's correct. That's where that's a leftover from that.
Yeah, we lost a lot of what the Greeks wrote, because they had their own dark ages, well before Christ, and this whole idea that you write it down is important, because it does keep the what is mythic, the mythology, consistent.
Yeah.
So it may not be real in the sense that it's a history book, but it's real in the sense that it is meaningful, and that is what is important. It's
a search.
Yes,
it's a search for an identity. It's a search to understand what you are, who you are.
Yeah, it's civilization. Ultimately, the civilization is that we hold these things in common, and one of those essential foundational components is our myths, our stories. These are things we value, not necessarily for themselves, although they are great stories just taken from themselves, but they also, because they're myths, they say something more. We want to be like these people.
Yes.
It could be the opposite. I mean, the Greeks and the Romans, their gods, we were playthings for them.
Right, but if you look at that, that is what formed the Greek empires before the Romans took them, and especially the Romans. Everybody was their plaything. Because that's emulating their gods.
Ding, ding, ding. Exactly. Our myths create our culture.
Yeah, well, it goes back and forth.
Exactly. They're symbiotic with each other, of course.
a little modern aside to that, after the Vikings TV show became really popular, a lot of guys started doing the Ragnar Lothbrok haircut, the shaved side.
Oh yes, we've seen it out there. Yeah.
People trying to emulate the character in the show.
That's because especially as he's portrayed by Travis Fimmel, who did such a great job.
Fantastic.
I mean, several really good actors.
I don't want to single just him out because they did a fantastic casting job on all those major roles through there, and we probably ought to give a shout to Catherine Winnick as Lagertha, who has her own mythology that they've kind of brought into this and tied together.
Well, her mythology is more based off the Danish account of Ragnar Lothbrok, because in the Icelandic sagas, Lagertha is nowhere to be found. Like she didn't exist in the Icelandic sagas.
See, it's
what's important to those who wrote.
That's exactly right.
Yeah,
and I'll give a little credit to the History Channel and all the folks with regards to both that and the great Bernard Cornwell with the Last Kingdom saga that put all this together and brought this back to a cultural awareness that I'm afraid was lost before that. We didn't know details about this, and daggone it, we should have, as you discovered.
Our history began at 1066.
That's exactly right.
You know, even when you think about the history classes that we took with the great Maggie Mahoney.
That's right.
History still began at 1066.
I know, isn't it amazing? And before that, you went back to Rome, and you talked about Charlemagne a little bit, but of this stuff
I'm talking
here,
about English history because obviously from Rome, the city, from Christian Rome on up, that's pretty well documented.
Right.
But for a people that primarily started on that island, that's where most of the formation of American culture comes from, is that island. Mm-hmm. And yet we still only go back slightly less than 1,000 years. Yeah. And that was still very formational, as we've talked about here. You know, without Ragnar Lothbrok and whether it is myth or reality around him, very much played into the founding of the Norman England.
Exactly, because you had to take these three very diverse groups of Saxons, Danes, and Normans, which of course were Danes, sort of kind of all together, and create this new people, this uniquely English people. You know, shame on us if we're not understanding that, because the English people that resulted from that, the same people that made the world England, created the British Empire, and won World War II, and all with help, etc., 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 all those great things.
They were seekers too.
They were seekers.
The irony of that is that
came from their Viking
in England, in modern English schools, they actually do teach about the Viking invasions. We don't do that.
See, exactly. I'll give them credit on that. They should. It is. We need to understand that.
We have a strain
so important to
the Norsemen
history.
Yeah.
And the irony is, in this day and age where we speak of the beauty of diversity and of multiculturalism, we're essentially disregarding a huge portion of that that is in a cultural background of so many.
Yeah, that diversity. It's going to sound critical of diversity, and it's not the way it's meant, but it often finds its expression in ethnic diversity more so than anything else, as opposed to the backgrounds of how everybody got here. So because the ethnicity of the country has been written by white people for the most part, that have a relatively common origin, which is vaguely called Europe, even though it comes from many places in Europe. That's all considered one, as if the story has already been told and we don't need to talk about it, but there's so much behind it.
That's right. Yeah. The tapestry is far richer.
It's not that the rest of it is not worth looking at.
No.
It's all worth looking at, and we do a disservice to all of it when we don't look deeper than that ethnic label for the diversity.
Well, yeah, labeling is ultimately dehumanizing anyway. We know that.
It's useful for categorization.
Yeah, but unfortunately that's often misused for all sorts of other purposes. The intention here is we should be granular. We should understand the real roots of what we're talking about here, because there's richness and power there that comes from all these pieces molding together to create a greater result.
Snakes and Otters is is all about seeking and tying together these sinews of the human experience.
Ooh, somebody write that down.
We've recorded it.
We're
We're good.
Human experience.
That's correct.
I love that.
That's right.
The
yes.
internet's forever.
Yes, it is.
The myth of Ragnar Lothbrok is part of those sinews, and we need to explore it. We need to know it. And if a TV show like Vikings does it, that's great. If a podcast does it, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
Bjern, you did an outstanding job. Thank you for being with us.
Yep.
We're going to wrap up the episode. So, Francis, what is next, buddy?
Oh, we're going back to Code of Honor again.
Excellent.
Next time. We always have great fun with those. We always come up with something we pull wherever we pull it from. I won't say. And Robert manages to bring it all back together and hammer it into a beautiful work of art somehow. Don't miss it.
Thanks for being with us here every week at Snakes and Otters, a pointless discussion of eternal questions. Be sure to spread the word on your social media accounts. Follow us and retweet us. We are on Instagram and on Twitter at Snakes and Otters.
Let your friends know that they can find us on Podbean, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and on YouTube. Just search Snakes and Otters Podcast to find us, and please remember to leave us your comments and reviews. It helps people find us.
And you can always send us an email at snakesandotterspodcast@gmail.com.
I'm Martin.
I'm Robert.
And I'm Francis. Catch us next week. Same snake time, same otter channel.